everyone, welcome to the March 21st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski as we look back at the last week in racing, highlighting some major stakes events, some allowance horses, some maidens, plenty of up-and-coming 3-year-olds that ran some nice races this past week, not necessarily in stakes company, so Craig and I will of course talk about all of that. No Derby preps, or at least no Derby preps worth points, were on tap this past week. We had talked about that a little bit on our forecast last week, so kind of a lull in that schedule for now, but things will definitely pick back up next week as they run 3 Kentucky Derby preps offering 100 points and then another one offering 50 points on Sunday, so a lot to discuss in terms of the handicapping. Looking forward to next week, but we're going to look back for just now and recap some racing from Oaklawn Park, where they did run a couple of grade 3 events on Saturday, Gulfstream, where they had some stakes on Saturday, but also some maiden and allowance races that achieved some pretty nice speed figures, which we will discuss. Moving on to Aqueduct, the card that we handicapped on the forecast last week. Stakes didn't come back that fast, the Cicada that we talked about, but there were some allowance and maiden races on that card that achieved some nice speed figures. Also on Sunday at Aqueduct, there was a pretty nice stakes race that we will talk about, and then we'll finish things up at Laurel and Fairgrounds, where there were some very nice Brad Cox-trained runners that made their splash on the 3-year-old scene. But we'll get to all of that at the end of the podcast, Craig. And we are going to talk about a lot of non-stakes events this week because there were plenty of horses that ran in allowance and maiden races that did achieve some nice speed figures.
Yeah, there were some good speed figures all around, even in the grade 3 Whitmore, which we're going to talk about, had a very big number. And just some of these maiden and allowance gave me some headaches, I'll tell you, because I don't always like to give huge speed figures to some of these maiden races, but I go with the clock when, as much as possible, and that's what I did. I'm sure we'll talk about those individually. So, and as far as those 3-year-olds, it's getting to the time where, it may be too late for Kentucky Derby, but we're seeing a lot of nice races from a lot of good 3-year-olds, particularly, as you mentioned, from the Brad Cox barn, that are still just breaking their maiden or running in first-level allowances. So it seems like there is a wealth of talent out there.
Well, a lot of those speed figure headaches did not stem from Oaklawn Park, where they, of course, only run on the dirt, so there are a lot of comparisons for Craig to do, and we'll start there with those pair of grade 3 events that took place on Saturday, the Whitmore and the Essex. The one that achieved the higher speed figure, Craig, was that 6-furlong Whitmore, and Tejano Twist. This is a horse that we've talked about quite a few times on this podcast because he runs very often. I think this was the 22nd start of his career, even though he is a pretty young 4-year-old. And he just keeps getting better with age and experience, and I love horses like this, the closing sprinters that tend to need some pace to close into, but it's pretty exciting when they're able to launch that run from far back and mow them all down in the stretch, and that's exactly what he did to win this Whitmore.
Yeah, he's having quite a season. He's a horse I saw as a 2-year-old in the Kip de Ville. He actually didn't win that day, but it was a really fast race with a huge gap back to second, and I've kind of become a fan of his ever since, particularly since he runs all the time. And this was a race where on paper it looked like there was a ton of pace. It was bunched up on the front end. I think it really heated up in that second quarter mile. You can see it in the TimeformUS pace figures, and just set up for Tejano Twist, and he was able to run a career best 126 coming from near the back of the pack. Good run. It was a good ride by Francisco Arrieta. He saved a lot of ground until he got clear in the lane, moved out, and just swooped on by, and just a really nice effort from him, I thought.
Yeah, this horse had shown a lot of talent as a 2-year-old, as you alluded to. They tried to go longer with him a couple of times. That's just not really for him. But since they've concentrated on the sprinting on dirt recently, he's really come to hand for trainer Chris Hartman. He's now won 4 of his last 5 races and just seems to be in fantastic form right now. And the same is true for Chris Hartman's other horse in this race, Craig, who almost completed the exacta with Tejano Twist, Edge to Edge, who did fade to third. But we talked about how much that pace really heated up in the middle portions of the race, and Edge to Edge was the only horse that was involved in that melee up front that was still around at the end.
Yeah, and he actually on the Timeform US scale is getting the same speed figure as the winner at a 126 because of how hot that pace was and how he was the only one able to stick around. It really drops off in the speed figure department from there back to fourth, which kind of matches the big gap that there was. But I would personally say he ran a little better race than miles ahead, the runner-up, who only got a 118 speed figure, which was good for him. It's right on par with his best races. He just ran into a horse that's in top form right now.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about how these Chris Hartman horses are just running exceptionally well this winter, both at Fairgrounds, but especially at Oaklawn Park. Started off that meet with a terrifying win percentage, and it seems like the success has just continued. And horses like Tejano Twist, who's always been good, but especially Edge to Edge, has just been in career form right now, just running speed figures that are far and away better than what he was capable of prior to this Oaklawn meet. So it's going to be interesting to see when racing shifts to some other circuits. A lot of these horses for Chris Hartman do go to Churchill Downs if they're able to continue to have that success, because based on these efforts, these are two of the better sprinters out there.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It is interesting. He was pretty hot at Kentucky at the end of last year, not quite to the level he is at Oaklawn, but it's not like he can't win at other tracks. But it's definitely something worth watching as a bettor to see if he can carry that form. Because if he can, it's going to offer some opportunities as these horses take money.
The other Grade 3 event on this Saturday card at Oaklawn was the Essex Handicap, going a mile and a 16th with, I believe, a $500,000 purse. And Greg, it's the resurgence of Last Samurai and the resurgence of trainer Dwayne Lucas, who is having a pretty nice Oaklawn meet. A couple of stakes wins, graded stakes, actually three of them now, I think, if you count Secret Oath, and the two for Last Samurai. And this horse just seems to be back in top form after kind of losing some of his best form in 2022. He had won that Oaklawn handicap for trainer Dallas Stewart back in last April, and then when he was initially switched into Lucas's barn, didn't have a whole lot of success during the summer, but his last few efforts have really been some of the best of his career. And I know this Essex didn't get nearly as fast a speed figure as the Razorback, but he looked pretty strong coming through the stretch.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold that against him. He had run a 125 last time, only got a 116 here. But I think that had a lot to do with the race itself. There wasn't a lot of pace. Classic Causeway was the one setting the pace. It was not quite slow enough to be get the blue color coding for slow, but it was borderline slow as the early fraction was a 106, the final time for the race a 119. So it was at best a moderate pace, and I think that affected the final time, particularly for a horse like Last Samurai, who, given that slow pace, was able to get good position from his outside post. He was sitting basically 2 to 3 wide, I would say, on the turn, mostly 2 wide. And it just seemed like he was waiting to make his move. I think he had the measure of the winner all the way and took over when asked. And like I said, I think he's better than that 116 speed figure. He is just in raging form. You do have to wonder if maybe a little bit of it is just an affinity for Oaklawn Park. But I thought he ran a pretty good race in the Pegasus as well. So maybe he's just as good as he's been right now.
Definitely seems that way, and that Pegasus just keeps looking stronger and stronger. We'll see Art Collector in action this weekend at Fairgrounds. I think we're going to talk about that more on our TimeformUS forecast this week. But as for Last Samurai, yeah, he's doing very well right now, and it looks like he's primed for a repeat victory in the Oaklawn Handicap, which is where I assume he'll be going next month. The extra 16th of a mile, stretching out to a mile and an eighth, figures to help him even more because he's a horse that definitely appreciates some added distance. And I agree with everything you were saying about the pace of this race, Greg. It really did hold together up front. The horses that were 1, 2, 3 early finished 2, 3, 4. And the only horse that was really finishing fast into those moderate fractions was Last Samurai, who ran by those first three finishers to win this race going away at the end. So just seems like he's one of the players in the handicap division, at least as of now, early in the year. On to another horse that could be a player in the handicap division later on, and that is Smile Happy, who made his 4-year-old debut in a Thursday allowance race going the mile and an eighth distance at Oaklawn. This was Smile Happy's first start since the Kentucky Derby last year. He obviously had been one of the elite 3-year-olds competing on the Kentucky Derby Trail. Did disappoint in the Run for the Roses, but coming back off the layoff, Craig, took the kind of step forward that you would be hoping to see with a newly turned 4-year-old.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think it was a really good sign. He got a career best 119 time form US speed figure. He did it in a race without a lot of pace. This one does have a bunch of blue color coded fractions. The final time figure is actually a 121. So that's what I like to see from a 4 year old when they come back. Actually exceed what we saw from them as a 3 year old, even though it's just a small step. I mean, this was his first race in a long time, and I think it's a really good sign that he's came back fully healthy and ready to go, and I expect to step forward next time.
Yeah, he definitely had some obstacles to overcome. You mentioned the pace. The track was sloppy. He had to deal with that. The mile and an eighth distance. That's not the easiest trip to come back at off a long layoff. And he handled all of that without any problems and finished up, I thought, pretty adequately, making a nice move off the far turn and then putting that rival that was chasing him home away. So probably on to graded stakes company after this, but definitely seems like Smile Happy could have a say in this older horse division this year if he continues to move forward. One more race to talk about from Oaklawn this past week, and that was a Friday allowance race going 6 furlongs, the same distance as the Whitmore. And Steve Asmussen has a horse, Craig, that would have been interesting to see what he could have done in the Whitmore. And that is Skelly, who has a ton of early speed and used it to good effect here as he just ran the entire field off its feet, making them come off the bridle around the far turn and then putting them away on the stretch. This horse had been impressive last time out, I believe, on the Rebel undercard, and he bettered that effort here.
Did it's funny you mentioned that. I was watching the Fox show on Friday, and Maggie Wolfendale had mentioned that maybe they chose the wrong race for Skelly. Turns out the speed figures say maybe not, particularly the way that race shaped up with all the speed. That race went in a 126, but Skelly got a 124 for his effort here. It was a big win for him. He is a horse who likes to run on the front end, and he took full advantage. It's not like he got handed the lead here. He was pressured early by Dr. Oscar, a horse right to his inside, and they battled it out for maybe a little more than a quarter mile, and he put that one away, and was just never really threatened by some pretty good horses in here. So good effort from him, and I would imagine there's no question that he will be in a stakes race next time.
Yeah, he's a 4-year-old, but he's still pretty lightly raced. He's only run 7 times in his career, only out of the exacta once, and that was when he got a nightmare of a trip in the slop at Oaklawn last December. So he typically shows up, and his last couple of efforts have been pretty progressive. So it's going to be interesting to see where this horse can go here. We always need more talent in this dirt sprint division, Craig. And so it's nice to see some of these horses posting some pretty big speed figures at Oaklawn Park this winter. Let's move on to Gulfstream, where we're just going to talk about one stakes race. They did run a couple of sprint stakes on Saturday. The Hutchison, which we previewed on the our stakes preview last week, just was not the most interesting race to talk about. The winner there, Chow, was much the best. Super Chow, I should say. I do want to talk about the Silks run, Craig, because it has a relationship to another race on this Gulfstream card that was also run at 5 furlongs. And the Silks run was the slower of these two 5 furlong races we're going to talk about, but I don't want to take anything away from the winner, Big Invasion, because it was nice to see him get back to the winner's circle. This horse had shown so much talent during his 3-year-old season, I think at one point reeling off 5 turf sprint stakes victories in a row. And he won this race the way you don't often see horses winning turf sprints at Gulfstream, coming from off the pace and making a wide move to victory.
Yeah, this was a nice effort by him. Like you mentioned, things kind of didn't go well at Kentucky Downs. That's not really a surprise. Sometimes horses just don't handle that track. Who knows if that's what happened, because he's been laid off since, so maybe something actually went wrong. But he was a colt that I was looking forward to maybe betting in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, but things didn't go right, and that's rare to say for a 3-year-old. He had been running some big speed figures. I like what I saw from him on Saturday. As you mentioned, it didn't come back particularly fast. It's only getting a 110 speed figure, but the way he did it, particularly at Gulfstream, I'm not going to hold the number against him too much. He did what he had to do, beat some pretty good turf sprinters in behind him, particularly over that Gulfstream course. So another one I would expect to move forward.
Yeah, this is one where this is a really tough day at Gulfstream, Craig, and I'm sure you're going to expand upon this when we talk about the dirt races too. But when they run so few races on each surface, and by that same token, same on the same surface and distance, it's really hard to make these comparisons. There were 3 5-furlong turf races at Gulfstream Park on this Saturday card. This big invasion race went, I think, a similar time to a Florida bred allowance race that we gave a very similar speed figure to in race 7. Feels like the Silks Run is one you might want to upgrade a little bit because we know these are horses of quality. Yes, I Am Free, Karatari. They're horses that are capable of running bigger numbers. And the way that Big Invasion did it, making that looping move 3 to 4 wide around the turn, coming from off the pace, his is a performance that I think you might want to upgrade a little bit, even though he only won this race by 3/4 of a length. Let's move on to another one of those 5-furlong races on Saturday at Gulfstream. It was a maiden special weight event that went earlier in the day, race 5. And Craig, if you take these numbers at face value, this horse, Accomplished Girl, just ran a significantly faster race than the Silks Run. I mean, she did win by a nice margin over 5 lengths. That's a pretty significant gap going 5 furlongs on the turf at Gulfstream. But it's just hard to know what to make of a 3-year-old filly running so fast in just the second start of her career.
Yeah, this one is one that gave me headaches and a little sleepless nights. I went back and I timed all the races to make sure they were timed correctly, and they were. The run up was the same, the gate was in the same place. Sometimes Gulfstream will use different chutes for the same distances, but they haven't really been doing that this year, and they didn't here, and it was a pretty tough call for me to give a figure this big, particularly with the stake, but particularly since there was another race in between at the same distance that pretty much fit with the others. I wound up giving her a 117 and just went with the clock. And when I went back and watched the race, I had somebody mentioned it on Twitter, so I went and watched it once and said, yeah, she looked good. But I went and watched it again, and she was just a rocket ship out of the gate. She saved every inch of ground. So if a horse is ever going to run an optimal speed figure, it would be given the trip that she got. And I think she did run a very fast race.
Yeah, and it's not like the number makes no sense at all for the horses that finished in behind her. It kind of fits with them. I mean, she just ran so much faster than everybody else. It was like she was in her own race. She was going fast right from the start and just basically kept up that pace for the entire race. It was kind of amazing to watch. That does kind of happen at Gulfstream sometimes. It's the kind of turf course where when you start going fast over these very short distances, that really firm course can carry you a little bit. And I think this course was rated very firm. It's a 9 out of 10 on a track condition rating scale in TimeformUS. So, that probably helped her achieve that fast time. And I would question whether she'll be able to do it over a different course or potentially going 5.5 or 6 furlongs. But no doubt about it, this filly ran really fast in her second start, breaking her maiden on Saturday.
Yeah, and that's the point you make is one I think would be wise for a lot of handicappers to do. Is a speed figure doesn't necessarily have to be wrong, and I'm using air quotes there, for it not to be one that you expect to be reproduced next time out. And it just depends where this horse shows up. If she shows up in Keeneland and runs 5.5, maybe. If she shows up at Belmont and runs 6, I'd be a little more skeptical. It's just one of those you have to kind of think about things and look at the percentages. How often do you think a horse like this will repeat that number?
Yeah, speed figures are a handicapping tool. They don't necessarily say who's better than who, even on the day. And I think if Big Invasion and Accomplished Girl showed up in the same race, I gather that both Craig and I would be leaning in Big Invasion's direction, even though he got the lower speed figure on Saturday. Move on to another race, Craig, that I imagine gave you some headaches, and that was a Saturday dirt maiden race that took place earlier at Gulfstream Park. I believe this one was race 3, going the 1-turn mile for the 3-year-olds. This one was won by Arcangelo, a third-time starter for trainer Jenna Antonucci, and this race just came up extremely fast. However you look at it compared to the other dirt races on the card, there were only 3 dirt races on the card, so maybe those are difficult comparisons to make, Craig, and complicating it even more is the fact that the horse that was second to him was a first-time starter, so we don't really have that baseline to know how fast this race was supposed to be.
No, the only good thing, the three dirt races that there were all pretty much lined up perfectly. I did go back and time them because Gulfstream has been known to have problems at the mile distance, given the very short run up there. Even since they switched from Trackers, now they use the G-Max, but they do have portable beams in place, and they seem to have worked just fine, as they mostly do. And it was just one again where there were other races on the card. The weather didn't change, the wind didn't really change, nothing seemed too out of whack. And I just went with the clock. The horse looked very good. He was coming out of a maiden race that was won by a very good horse in King's Barnes, a horse that we're going to see in the Louisiana Derby, I think, on Saturday. So, it's just one. I went with the clock, and I'll certainly be tracking it, but that's what I'm going to do when there's a lot of, when I have question marks and don't really have a clear path. I'm going to side with what the clock tells me. And that 134.82 was a very fast race on this track.
I don't think we've mentioned the number yet, but this horse is getting a 118 Timeform US speed figure, which is a giant figure for a 3-year-old at this time of year. I believe it's faster than most of the Kentucky Derby preps have been run. Not to say this horse is necessarily going to thrust himself into the Triple Crown conversation, but he ran a big race. And it's not just that he got that number, Craig. When I went back and watched this race, I mean, he was in a decent position early, trying to move up between horses on the turn, but he got himself into a little bit of traffic at the quarter pole, had to pause, lose some momentum, come around horses, and once Javier Castellano got him into the clear, it's like he just found a second wind, and he was absolutely flying through the wire. I mean, I was initially concerned about the timing of this race because that final eighth of a mile in 11.17 seconds just seems ridiculously fast for the way these races usually go for the one-turn mile at Gulfstream Park. But when I went back and watched the replay, it seems legit. This horse was just flying through the wire, and he galloped out huge after that. I mean, he ran a gigantic race. I'd love to know the story on this horse because, I mean, you don't think of these connections as having a top runner. And I look at the pedigree. He's by Arrogate. This is a huge female family. Modeling, she's a half-sister to a horse named, I believe, Steaming, who was a Grade 1 winner, won the Hollywood Starlet. It's a really, really strong second generation. It's that Better Than Honor family that's produced Rags to Riches and Jazzle. How did this horse sell for $35,000 as a yearling? There must be some story there that this horse has some physical imperfections because it seems like a crazy price for the horse with this kind of pedigree.
It does. And I mean, there were some pretty highly regarded horses in here. The first time starter, runner up for Todd Pletcher, ran a 114, which is going to win races like this 99% of the time. And he wasn't particularly close. He went off 6-5, so people were expecting a good one. The third runner was a Bill Mott horse who had debuted at Saratoga, took some action that day, and something clearly went amiss. He just didn't run a step. But he came back and took some action on this card again, so I assume he has some talent, wound up with a 103. So a race I'm just very intrigued to follow going forward. And I'm with you. I'd love to hear the story on this horse. And depending where he goes, I assume it'll come out at some point.
We saw another big effort going that one-turn mile distance on the dirt on Friday at Gulfstream Park in an allowance race, and that was turned in by the older mare Beth's Dream, who, Craig, this horse just seems like a different animal at Gulfstream than she is everywhere else because her 4 victories have all come on the Gulfstream dirt. They are just lopsided wins that are as easy as can be, and she just can't reproduce that form elsewhere. I mean, a little bit odd, but no doubt about it, she put in a gigantic effort to win this race on Friday.
She did. She wound up with a 120 speed figure, and this was another one that I kind of had to look back and say, who is this horse that ran a 120, particularly knowing that it was a filly or mare that did it. But when I saw the PPs, I didn't really have a lot of doubt. As you said, she's won 4 races at Gulfstream. I think she lost her debut, but ever since then, perfect. And it's not like she's just winning them. She's just absolutely laying waste to the fields that she faces, and did so again here. Don't know what to make of her. I know I wouldn't bet against her if she shows up at Gulfstream again. I'd be a little more skeptical if she raced somewhere else until she proves she can carry that form. I mean, it's not like she ran terrible at Tampa in her first start this year, coming off a layoff. She got a 113 figure that day. which was upgraded some because she pressed it and even was setting a very fast pace with red coated fractions. But it's one that I'll just be skeptical of till we can see it on a different track.
Yeah, I mean, and she's run, as you said, she's run okay at some other places. I mean, her best performance out of town was probably when she was second in that Lady Secret at Monmouth last summer, just losing by a head to Leader of the Band, who's a nice horse. But, I mean, I'm making the point that this horse on Friday looked like a grade 1 winning mare. I mean, that's the kind of quality that she was displaying. I mean, it's the 120 TimeformUS speed figure, but if you go back and watch this race, Jose Ortiz looked like he was on a horse that he was just galloping in the morning. I mean, he never asked her for anything at any point in this race, and she just cantered through the stretch so easily. I mean, this is a margin of victory that was 8 lengths that probably could have been 15 if he had asked her at any point in the stretch drive. She was just winning this race so easily. And the other thing I want to make about this race is there must have been something going on with the track, the dirt course at Gulfstream on Friday, because if you watch those races, every rider that seemed like he was on a live mount kept their horse way out into the track, like the 5, 6, 7 path, and that's what Jose Ortiz did with Beth Stream. He had her far out into the back on the the 6th path on the back stretch, continued about 5 wide around the far turn, and then was even wider on the stretch. When you watch the races, it seems like there's this colored strip of dirt, like about the 6th path coming down the stretch, that riders were just going to. I don't know if that was left over from a tire track or extra water there or something, but there was definitely some kind of pronounced outside, like way outside bias this day that riders were taking advantage of, and Beth Stream basically rode that coveted path for the entirety of her trip. So something to note about this performance and maybe this horse moving forward. Move on to Aqueduct. We talked a little bit about Aqueduct last week, and we're going to get to some of those races that were part of that Pick 5 sequence that we handicapped. But first, let's talk about some of the Sunday races that earned some nice speed figures. And first and foremost among those was the featured stakes race on Sunday for the 3-year-old New York breds, the Damon Runyon. And Craig, this was a race that featured a very fast pace, and the winner looms boldly, who, of course, is named after Pete Fornatal of In the Muddy Media. Of course, his Twitter handle looms boldly. This horse going out for 10 Strike Racing and Marshall Grab put forth a nice effort, second off the layoff, but I mean, he was part of that very fast pace and was able to survive it, so definitely deserves some credit for that.
Yeah, and he got plenty extra credit. This race got a 99 final time speed figure, but a 112 TimeformUS overall number. And I'd say he earned it. He was able to duel with the very fast horse Andiamo a Firenze, a horse they finally cut back in distance to where he belonged, and I would imagine he'll be staying there. But both of these top two ran very well. I think it was an interesting race in that not a single horse, I don't think, changed position the entire race. It was just a merry-go-round, but I think that just came down to the top two were much better than the others. They couldn't keep up early, and it's not like any of them were closing type runners. They were just chasing a fast pace, couldn't handle it, and these two were much the best. So I think those speed figures are pretty legitimate, and a couple of good New York bred sprinters.
Yeah, there's an argument that speed was a bit of an advantage on Sunday. Some might even argue the rail was good. I'm on the fence about that. I kind of want to go back and watch some of these races, and we're going to talk about another one where it seemed like maybe that wasn't the case. But definitely Looms boldly kept going on the front end here after setting those quick fractions. And as you said, Andiamo a Firenze also putting in a good effort, finally figuring out that he is indeed a sprinter. I don't know why they were trying derby preps with him, but he is a New York bred sprinter and one of some quality, and he put in a game effort here. But Looms boldly, who was just aggressively sent to the front end by Manny Franco, he was able to hold on to his advantage. And this was a race that I kind of reassessed after scratches when I was doing the handicapping, because there was another speed in here originally entered for the Kelly Breen barn that came out, and it just seemed like after scratches Looms boldly had to be sent to the front, and that's what happened, and he was able to hold on at 5-1. 112 TimeformUS speed figure, pretty good for this New York bred. Let's move on to another race on Sunday's card that earned a nice speed figure. That was actually the race right before the Damon Runyon, won by Bourbon Calling, an older runner in this allowance optional claiming event. And this horse, Craig, has just been in great form since the claim by Antonio Arriaga. He's winning his third in a row, and he just keeps improving his speed figure every time.
Yeah, this is a horse that almost always seems to show up. I mean, he was a horse that kept collecting checks. I remember it took a long time for him to break his maiden. He finally did it. Then he's won a bunch of allowance races. Seems like every time he got moved into stakes, he would maybe regress or not show up, and then he would run okay. And as you mentioned, he got claimed a couple back because he was in for 32, claimed from David Jacobson, and things have went swimmingly well since. It's his third win in a row. He's improved his Timeform US speed figure every single time, all the way up to a 120 this time. So not sure what the plans are for him, but he's certainly in best form, and I would imagine the connections are going to want to take advantage of that and maybe move him into some tougher races.
Yeah, claimed for 32,000, and he's earned 143,000 in his next three starts. So that's a dream claim for these connections. So we'll see where he goes next. But he was not claimed out of this race for the 80,000, even though being in for that tag. And we'll see what they decide to do with him. But just a horse that's in great form right now, and he was somewhat forward, but he was outside the entire way. So maybe that works against that inside or rail bias narrative a little bit. Good efforts from the second and third place finishers. Curlin's Wisdom and Market Alert. The real disappointment in this race was the heavy favorite, Untreated, a horse who had been competitive in graded stakes last year for Todd Pletcher, third in the Pimlico Special and the Suburban, fourth in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. I don't know what happened off the layoff, Craig, but he just did not look like the same horse.
No, he just never ran at all. It'll be interesting to see where Todd Pletcher places him next time out if we see him anytime soon, because that was ugly.
Also, this past weekend at Aqueduct on Saturday, a couple nice speed figures worth mentioning. An allowance race for the New York Breds was won by Ouster. This was one of the races that we handicapped on the forecast last week. And Craig, we both respected Ouster. I just wanted to take some shots against him at a very short price. But Mark Hennig has this horse in excellent form right now. It really feels like ever since they stretched him out in distance, first on the turf and now on the dirt, he just continues to get better and took another step forward here to win this race pretty convincingly.
Yeah, I had mentioned on the forecast there was a speed figure that I had some questions about when I made it, but I went with the clock as I usually tend to do, and I'm really glad I did there because it showed it was probably 100% legit. Alster showed up, it actually improved on that speed figure, went from a 116 to a 118, and visually just looked really good doing it. It seemed like he could have won by more if Dylan Davis had actually wanted to.
Yeah, I really like this horse. He's a big, burly 5-year-old who just looks like he's really heading in the right direction right now, and the patience that they've taken bringing him along has really paid off. And nice to see Mark Hennig have a good horse, and it seems like this is one that is going to be bound for New York Bred Stakes Company in pretty short order. One more race to talk about from that Saturday card at Aqueduct was the final race of the day, also a New York bred race, this one for Maiden Special Weight Company, the 3-year-olds. And Craig, I don't know where this came from, because both you and I were a little bit skeptical of Lifetime of Chance, and we handicapped this race last week. He had, just run poorly in his start prior to this, but Linda Rice, who just seems like she's getting everything to run right now at Aqueduct, was able to turn this one around, and this horse delivered a big effort to win this race by a whopping 16 lengths.
Yeah, that was a bit insane. The horse jumped up to a 113 Timeform US speed figure, and all I can say as a handicapper is it seems like with Aqueduct, when these trainers get hot, you just have to ride with it or sit them out, because we saw similar from Rob Atras very recently where he was just winning with everything. And same thing with Linda Rice now. She's winning at like a plus 80% clip over the last week or so, and yeah, I don't know how you can explain this performance other than to say it's a hot barn.
Yeah, based on this kind of effort, Lifetime of Chance is going to be winning stakes soon, although this was the first time we had ever seen that kind of ability out of him, so it's going to be interesting to see where he goes from here. But it wouldn't be the first time, Craig, that we've seen a big speed figure popped in the winter at Aqueduct that isn't repeated elsewhere or even in the horse's next start. It's just a quirky kind of surface that could produce these big margins of victory at times, so we'll see what happens with some of these horses that ran so well this past weekend. Moving on to Laurel, where they ran a slew of stakes races on Saturday. We're going to talk about a couple of the dirt routes that they ran. The Harrison E. Johnson Memorial was won by the older horse Nimitz Class, who is just in great form right now, and another horse that, since they've stretched him out in distance to dirt routes, he has really blossomed, now 4 for 4, going longer on the dirt.
Yeah, it feels like we mentioned him last time on the Pacecast. I could be wrong, but
Yep,
he's just
we
a
did.
horse who is, yeah, who is in really good form right now, particularly as you said, since he's tried 2 turns on the dirt. He's yet to lose, and he certainly didn't look like he was going to lose this week. Just another big effort from him. He matched the speed figure from last time with a 118, did it as easy as could be. So, not sure what the plans are for him, but on that Mid Atlantic circuit, he's going to be tough in these older horse stakes races.
Yeah, in his prior race, that was going the 2 turns. I think he had set an extremely slow pace and then sprinted home. In this race, he set a more legitimate pace, a more contested pace, and still was able to finish off his own fraction. So definitely a horse that is doing very well right now. Other dirt route stakes that we'll mention was the private terms, this one for the 3-year-olds. And I don't know if this race is necessarily considered a derby prep, Craig, obviously not offering any qualifying points, but Ken McPeak was saying after the race that the winner, Hayes Strike, is probably going to go on to the Bluegrass in his next start, so they're at least going to try to make a final push for the derby with him. And this is a horse that actually showed some quality as a 2-year-old. He was third in the Kentucky Jockey Club against some very good horses. Had finished, I think, fourth in the stakes at Fairgrounds. So he had shown quality at different points, although struggled with consistency. Definitely put forth one of his good efforts here.
Yeah, that's kind of the typical way that the PPs look for a lot of Ken McPeak horses because he just keeps running them. It seems like he isn't deterred much by bad efforts. He goes back to the drawing board, and whatever he did, it worked here because the horse elevated to a career best 109 TimeformUS speed figure. Did so in impressive fashion. I don't know that we're really seeing a Derby kind of horse, but generally races like this, we'll usually see maybe 1 or 2 show up in the Preakness or definitely on the Preakness undercard. So a race worth watching, but yeah, I'd have my doubts about a race like the Bluegrass. That 109 still puts him pretty far behind some of the better horses.
Seems like a tall ask, but he did get the 2-turn distance here and finished up pretty nicely. And the horse that he beat, Coffee with Chris, I think we've mentioned him on the Pacecast before. He's run some big speed figures at different points. A mile and a 16th is probably pushing it for him a little bit. He's been more of a 1-turn specialist, but at least he beat a good horse here. Let's move on to Fairgrounds, where we're going to talk about 3 races, none of them stakes events, but all 3-year-old performances from the Brad Cox barn. And Brad Cox just seems to have an endless bench of good 3-year-olds right now, not all of them pointing towards the Kentucky Derby, apparently, as it seems like all of these horses are going to be a little bit late to that party if they try to get there. But Craig, we had talked about on that Risen Star undercard how there had been that very fast 6-furlong maiden race won by Bishop's Bay, but also the other Brad Cox trainee, First Mission, who was making his debut as well, finished second, and they had gotten some big speed figures. They both ran back this weekend at Fairgrounds. First up was First Mission, who ran on Saturday, stretching out to the 2 turns for the first time, and he certainly passed that initial stamina test.
He did. I was happy to see it because, I always sweat these big maiden speed figures, but he certainly backed up that 114 he ran. He's going to get a 109 here. That's actually knocked down from a 112 final time because the pace was pretty moderate in here, but just a good strong effort from him. One as easy as could be. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's probably too late. I would hope these horses aren't rushed into like the big 100-point races because it just seems like a bit much this late in the game. But he's certainly a horse with some talent who's going to be in stakes races sooner rather than later.
Yeah, Brad Cox already has too many horses for those races, so I don't think he needs even more, and there are definitely big races later in the year, as you said, that they can point to, but First Mission definitely seems like the kind that could eventually have some stakes on his radar, because this was the kind of step forward that you would have been hoping to see, as you said, validating that first time out speed figure and showing that he could do it over a longer distance, and this is just a really robust son of Street Sense. There's not a whole lot of dam side pedigree here for this Godolphin homebred, but but definitely seems like one that wants more ground, and especially the way that he finished and galloped out would lead you to believe that he has further to go in terms of development. The horse that beat him on debut was Bishop's Bay, and we saw him in action on Sunday in a first level allowance race. He was also stretching out to the 2 turns for the first time, trying the 1.70 mile distance. And Craig, for a number of reasons, this horse never really had a chance to repeat his debut speed figure because there was some trouble into the first turn, and also the pace was just so incredibly slow. They really never had a chance to run a fast final time.
Yeah, if we had the option to use a different shade of blue, this race would probably get it. It would be like a deeper, darker blue than we even use because the pace was just a crawl. It kind of made the final time figure irrelevant. I would guess, I don't have the official figure yet, that the final time figure is going to be around the 98. There were several other routes. We're going to talk about another one of them. But this one definitely is getting the pace upgrade for a lot of reasons. This horse is going to wind up with about a 105. I think the figure, as far as he's concerned, is pretty irrelevant. He did everything right. I would trust that first big speed figure more as an indication of his talent than I would this one. And just liked everything I saw. He's one, maybe he will get the chance since he has a little bit more experience now that he has 2 wins. But still seems a little behind the 8 ball as far as moving into the big races. But again, just another one with big talent from the Brad Cox barn, and he's certainly bred to be a very good one as well.
Yeah, I think I saw in our colleague Marcus Hirsch's article after this race that Brad Cox explicitly said this horse is not going on to a Derby prep. So probably good news. This one seems like he has a lot of talent, and they'll probably handle him that way. But yeah, just never had a chance to run a fast final time. But I do want to note, I mean, it seemed like they were toying around with the idea of raiding him into that clubhouse turn, and he legitimately clipped heels with a horse in front of him. A scary moment where, I mean, he honestly could have gone down if that had been a little bit worse, but was able to regain his footing and his stride and get into a pretty good rhythm, stalking the pace. And when they kicked for home, he found an acceleration and was able to put away his competition, but had that other Brad Cox trainee, Demolition Duke, range up outside of him and briefly looked like that stablemate was actually going to go by him. But I loved the way that Bishop's Bay dug in and lowered his head and turned back that rival to maintain his neck advantage to the wire. It was kind of the exact same character trait that we had seen from him when he defeated First Mission on debut, when it looked like First Mission was going by in mid-stretch, and he was able to hold that one off. So it seems like this horse really does have that guts and that will to win, which you like to see from these horses with a lot of natural talent. And we talked about first time out, how he had the pedigree to go longer, proved that he could do it here. So I'll be very interested to see where this horse goes next time.
Yeah, and I don't want to totally. I'm glad you mentioned Demolition Duke because he ran a very good race as well. He was coming from further behind that just dawdling pace. So he's one who had won his debut first time out, stretched out just fine here, and obviously very talented as well. So just a case of more of the rich get richer. And the horse who was in third in here had run some pretty good races himself for Steve Asmussen, first defender. So it's not like they were beating nobody in here. I will mention Bishop's Bay is probably a little lucky that that incident occurred in a race where there was no pace. So it was pretty easy to recover without losing a lot of ground. That could be a lot more dangerous in a race with a fast pace where that bobble could cost you quite a bit more distance than it did here.
One more race to talk about on this Pacecast, also from the Fairgrounds on Sunday, and that was the maiden race that actually took place right after Bishop's Bay won, featuring yet another Brad Cox exacta, as he sent out a couple of first-time starters, both of whom seemed to have some quality, including the winner, Promise Me a Ride, who went a little bit farther than Bishop's Bay. I think this one was 1.16 miles, whereas Bishop's Bay went 1.70 miles. But Craig, this race on the surface of things came up a little faster, had a different pace setup though.
Yeah, very different pace setup. This one was played straight. There were other routes on the card. Luckily, these weren't the only two, or it would have kind of been a nightmare as far as speed figures go. But there were, I think, 2 or 3 more besides these two, which made it pretty easy. This one is going to be rated with the others, I would assume, when I get the speed figures back. I'm guessing it's going to be around the 105. So just another very good 3-year-old in the Brad Cox barn that I'm sure we're going to hear about later in the year. I think Mastery, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is a first-year sire, but sure seems like I've seen plenty of winners from him.
I think we're in Mastery's second crop right now. But yeah, this is he's a pretty young sire. Hasn't had too many top runners. Some of them have not been that precocious. So interesting that he actually had a first out winner here with Promise Me a Ride. This one didn't sell for that much. Not a ton of dam side pedigree, but seems to have ability. He always traveled like a winner of this race. So looks like yet another good one for Brad Cox. And the runner up in this race, Tap the Drum. I mean, he's the one that has pedigree. He's a half brother, actually a 3/4 brother to Monomoy Girl. So he's bred to be a good one and maybe just needed this experience on debut. But there is no lack in depth of talent in the Brad Cox stable when it comes to the 3-year-olds right now.
Yeah, one thing I don't think we mentioned, this was an off the turf race. I think it scratched down to only 5 horses. So I do always view these races a little more suspect, particularly since these horses were entered. Who knows what the plan was? Maybe they had a feeling it was coming off the turf, but just a little knock on the race in general.
Well, that's it for the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Craig and I will be back a little earlier in this week than usual to do the forecast. We will be handicapping the Fairgrounds Pick 5 on Saturday, which features that Louisiana Derby. That is the feature there. So Craig and I will go through that all-stakes sequence, and we'll be putting that out, I believe, on Wednesday this week. So you can look for that a little bit earlier than usual if you want to get a head start on your Fairgrounds handicapping. But for now, that's the Pacecast. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Everybody, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast that will be coming out fairly soon.